All right, very good. I propose we get started. Um, Felix, just to be clear, you can see my screen, right? I'm sharing my screen. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Perfect. Very good. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this webinar by Carbon+Delete on the topic of benchmarking companies based on their climate impact. We're happy to again see a lot of you joining today. We still expect some more people to join. There was, due to a Teams update, two basically links that have been distributed. So I can imagine that some people indeed tried the first link and then realized it was the second link. So I still expect some people to join as we go. But let's get started. So today it will not only be me doing the talking. I invite my colleague Felix. For those who don't know us yet, two words of introduction about ourselves. So I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Carbon+Alt+Delete. I have a background in engineering. I'm deep inside, still very much a carbon geek, but day to day, I'm busy in building Carbon+Delete as a company. One word on Carbon+Delete. We are a carbon accounting software provider, managing the full corporate carbon footprint calculations of company, the reporting piece, calculation piece, but also the what we call the analysis piece, science-based target setting, mitigation planning, and so on. What makes us a bit different than many other tools is that we work exclusively with sustainability consultants, and we do that with consultants across Europe and beyond. So that's one word on Carbon+Delete. I brought Felix, one of my colleagues. Felix, feel free to say a couple of words on who you are and what you do at Carbon+Delete.
Yeah, I'll keep it quite short, actually. So I'm Felix. I am the lead carbon expert at Carbon+Delete, and that means that me and my small team, we are like responsible for everything methodological in the app. So everything to do with the compliance and adhering to the different frameworks, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, etc., and how that is implemented and built in. And then secondly, almost equally as important, if not more, everything emission factor related. So how the emission factors are built and show up in our app and how they read out and how they're methodologically correct. The whole engine that is running there is what we do. So yeah, I'm also engineer by training, but today Kenneth will do the hard work actually. I will only do the introductions.
Not sure, right? I think we have an equal split today for the heavy lifting. So very happy to have you. Thanks a lot, Felix. Before we dive into the content, one slide of housekeeping rules. So we are very happy to have a big audience. That's great to see there's so much interest. The downside is that it's a bit harder to make it very interactive. So we have switched off your camera by default, and we have muted you by default. Apologies for that. Don't take it personally. But I would invite you to interact through the chat. So there is a regular chat in Teams, but they also have a Q&A chat. So typically at the top of your screen, you see a Q&A chat. Feel free to use the Q&A chat because there you can upvote questions from others. We know from experience that sometimes this functionality is blocked by your local Microsoft settings. In that case, just use the regular chat with questions. We have a Q&A foreseen towards the end of the webinar, but we have a habit of keeping an eye on the questions that come in. So don't wait until the end, just put in your questions, and if already relevant, we can already address them as we go. So the topic of today is benchmarking corporate carbon footprints. I know the majority of the people here in the call calculate carbon footprint for other companies as sustainability consultant, or are maybe a sustainability manager managing the carbon footprint of their own company. In both cases, I can imagine that sometimes you want or you think about or you get questions about, okay, how does my carbon footprint or how does the carbon footprint of my clients compared to others? How good or bad am I doing? So that's the topic that we will discuss today. That's what we refer to with benchmarking climate impacts or benchmarking corporate carbon footprints. So as always, we'd like to start with a quick poll, basically a Mentimeter poll, to see who's in the room and what experience you have with this. So basically, how do you benchmark corporate carbon footprints? If you scan the QR code or if you go to menti.com and you use this code, I think one of my colleagues will also put it in the chat, you get this question. I see some answers were coming in. So basically, let me already show that on the screen. I still keep it open for a couple of seconds. If this wants to move to full screen, there we are. So questions are still coming in. So we see that a majority, about half of you who have answered, do a public search. I'm just Googling or using ChatGPT, I can imagine. About a quarter is not really doing it. And then the remaining quarter is having their own data set. That's interesting. Using CDP or the likes, and the two people that are still doing something else, curious to know what that is, feel free to share that in the chat. So overall, it's good to see that the majority of you does benchmarking, but the way that you do it is still pretty diverse. With that, I'm happy to give the floor to you, Felix. So the agenda of today are basically three topics. Felix will guide you through the first two questions. The first one is, why is benchmarking actually important? Why do we need to spend time on it? And then second, what makes a benchmark a good or a bad one if you not live up to certain criteria? And then I'll take it over again to explain more in detail how we do it in Carbon+Alt+Delete. I know there are some Carbon+Alt+Delete users in the audience. They have seen that we have this benchmarking functionality under beta for quite some time because we had to collect additional data. And I'm very happy that we will finally release it right before Christmas. So in the third part, I will explain exactly what we do about benchmarking climate impacts in Carbon+Alt+Delete and how we go about it. But first, Felix, I see you already taken over the screen. Go ahead on the first two topics.
All right. Thank you for that, Kenneth. I won't see the chat or the cameras while I'm presenting, so if anything I need to know, let me know. That being out there, my task here is to discuss with you the following two questions: why benchmarking is important, and what is a good benchmark. And for the first, I think it's a bit self-answering. Of course, if it was not important, you wouldn't be here. That kind of already says it. But let's try to be a bit more methodological about that, and discuss what motivates people, or why we think this is something that needs to be part of any proper carbon accounting strategy. And so let's first start from the self-motivated part. Like, why do companies want to do a carbon footprint themselves? And for this, the reasons are multifold, but we like to just approach this one anecdotally, because you can see a few things play up again and again when people are like considering or looking out for benchmarks. And the first is actually usually this one is like, is my carbon footprint a good one? It's kind of motivated just out of like a comparison need or understanding need. You get this number, you get this CO2e value. Like, what does it mean? Like, how can I now like know if this is good or bad? How do my peers do this? What is this number exactly? Not that familiar with it. So this is the first motivation. Usually, is just like making sense of the numbers that you already got. And then obviously the question becomes like, what are my peers doing? How do I relate to that? But that's definitely not the only one, because a second motivation or second positioning that we often see is it's because of bragging rights. Like, very quickly, once we start looking up our peers, we try to at least like find a way that we can say that we're doing well or we're not doing bad. Usually, it even involves some clever ways of reaccounting or recounting or sectorizing, or maybe having a different thing to compare against, like maybe your footprint compared to production hours or whatever you can find, so that you come up like relatively positively, or you come up ahead. So this is like a second motivation that we see why the companies want to do the benchmarking themselves. And then thirdly, and this is definitely also not a minor use case, is that it's actually like only even the very starting point of a thing. Like often the benchmark, we see that people are re requesting that or looking at that information very, very early on in the process, even before they have a proper benchmark or they have a proper carbon footprint themselves. It's kind of like just a first estimate of what this should be, what this number would look like, what things are important. Maybe it's like what the size of scope 3 is, for example, or maybe like what are other companies doing and measuring, and it's kind of like setting the goalpost of what is expected or what we're trying to achieve. So that is what we kind of see these three different motivations is like just understanding the numbers, then also like being able to position yourself positively towards your peers, and then also just using this as the first estimate, as like the way to define what the project even is going to be. And those are, of course, all three very valid reasons to go for benchmark, all internally driven. Well, we also have another way to look at this. This is more like externally or as a society, like why do we think that there's a need for a footprinting benchmark? What is the purpose of it? And this is very much where we dive into like the social studies and the psychology, and we can look at the peer effect. So there's strong literature on the peer effect, which is that just in general, not only companies that like we just like or we're much more likely to perform sustainable action, show sustainable behavior when we see people that look like us also behave in a sustainable way. It's definitely also the intergroup comparison. It's not just anyone. It has to be someone that you identify with that looks like you, and then suddenly your likelihood of showing sustainable behavior in general can grows tremendously. There's others field or there's others aspects in where this comes to play. So this is a study on sustainable investing. So what the peer effect is on sustainable investing. If you see your peers taking into account sustainability aspects or footprinting data, so to say, or whatever in their investment decisions, you are much more likely as well to start considering that or making that a big factor of that. Additionally, this is another study where we go like sector specific. So in a specific sector, we can look at the role of benchmarking, like just the ability to be able to compare within your sector with your peers and how they are doing on their sustainability performance has big influences on how you position yourself, what you're strategizing, how much you speed up or sometimes slow down your actions in that regard. Then another study, which I think is very cool because it shows a very strong effect, is and it's very tangible and physical, is the pure effect of just like seeing solar panels around you in your neighborhood is a very big indicator that you will be motivated or likely to install solar panels on your rooftops as well. I think most people living in countries where there was a solar boom in the past decade know this. Like this, it's not uniformly distributed. It goes in spurts in certain neighborhoods. And this beautiful study even has lines of sight included. Like if you can see a solar panel from your home window, then you're much more likely to install one yourself. And this is not only for household, like it really you can definitely make further analogies for organizations. And I'll speed up a little bit. So we have performance in supply chains. If you see upst upstream supply chain sustainability consideration being more important, it can get more important in your own production process. And apologies. And this final paper, I think, summarizes it well, the power of peers in behavioral finance. So just the ability to compare to peers that are also showing sustainability behavior will motivate you to do the same for your organization, for your applications. And so regardless if you're looking at it as an individual level or organizational level or households or full companies or for full sectors, the ability to compare to your peers that are doing also certain sustainability actions will influence how much you will be doing them yourself and how much you will be investing in them. And I'll take a second to get this out of the way. Okay, and with that, we have I guess, the first part done, which is why it is important. We are all motivated now, and now we can look at what is a good benchmark. I'm looking at time. I am doing quite well. Um, so what is a good benchmark? For us, we have tried to answer that question with three success criteria. We think that these are important parts to have a successful benchmark, and then with that we mean like a benchmark that is useful in achieving its goal, um, which is inspiring you to take action on your emissions. So, apologies. So the first of that um, is relevance. So we um, we need a benchmark to be like relevant for the company we are looking at. Like it's one of the most important questions is what are we benchmarking against? And for this, the most important aspects are which sector are we looking at, which region are we looking at, and which time period are we looking at. It's all quite obvious, but uh, it's quite clear that like a steel manufacturing sector will have a completely different emissions profile than a service sector, right? And different regions have different carbon intensities in their energies and their electricities, for example. That is also a completely different ballpark to be playing at. And time periods, like there's been negative trends all over the place, so comparing to data that is 10 years out of date or something completely skews your picture as well. So they're quite obvious, but it's not that easy to find like actual benchmark data that qualifies these criteria that already get stuck in this first piece of success criteria. To illustrate, I brought this graph from this study that just shows like the carbon intensity of different sectors in China as in CO2 per 1001. And I think this proves already all of these points. So these different sectors have completely different emission profiles. Here, high carbon intensity sectors that can often be a 10x difference with a low carbon intensity sector. So completely different things to compare against. But also very clearly, we see these time trends, especially in this region. This time trend is super obvious. This is between 1995 and 2015. So in that 20-year time period, the start and the end of that time period also has a 5x difference. So it is important to know like what are you comparing against and what is the base data. But I also want to point out with this one that not each of the sectors has the same profile. Like most of them has this downward trends, but there's also sectors where this trend is much more flatlined and that kind of stuff. So um, it really is sector, region, and time period specific if you want to make like a proper comparison. That's only one part of the puzzle, of course. And then second part of the puzzle is in general size of the companies. And we're a Belgian organization, Carbon+Delete, so I'll make a very Belgian example here. We'll compare breweries and beer. So we have, on the one hand, a very big brewery, a super international AB InBev, Stella Artois, and then we have a smaller SME brewery, Brouwerij Het Anker in Mechelen. And well, when you try to compare these to each other, of course, their direct emissions don't compare. Like the big one will have so much bigger emissions than the other one. But more interestingly is like how do you work with that difference? Like the big company will have more emissions, and it will also have additional benefits of like data being more easily available and audited and more standardized. So it has more data, and there's more data in that big sector kind of companies. But at the same time, they have complex scaling laws, like usually with intensity like turnover and financial intensity, they will be more efficient. Although then, if you compare with FTEs, they might be less efficient, because of all the overhead. But you can also look at FTE for the production crew only, and then you have a different relationship. So scaling is clearly important, and it's clearly important to position yourself within a sector. But if you take two big gaps in scaling and you go from very big companies to very small ones, you might actually have sometimes a step change where you can actually lose the ability to properly compare against. So normalization is super important, but it also has its limits and its challenges. Um, Next up, and this I think we find super important in our approach, is communicating about the distribution. So just as we saw with the examples above, like it's not just one number. You cannot benchmark to the average. It's a very complex relationship with a lot of variety within the distributions of the different companies and sizes of companies and different subsections of a certain sector. And in order to do that properly, you really need to look at it as a distribution. And you don't only need to understand where the mean lies, but you also want to understand like how do you compare to the mean and how even is your distance to the mean to be interpreted, right? Right? Like if how far are you off and how far are you off compared to all the others? Like you want to know where the top 10% performers are, you want to know where the laggards are, where the median is maybe, how it is queued, so you can understand certain aspects of it, like to understand, for example, how far behind you are and how many more people are, for example, not achieving your carbon intensity. Like we see, and I'm running a bit ahead here, but we see a lot of power law distributions in our data. So these have long fat tails, so that contains a lot of interesting information. Like you might be far away from the mean, but there's still like a lot of additional organizations and companies behind you that even have bigger carbon intensities. And just we want to communicate up front about distribution so you can understand all these relationships much better and much clearer. Then a fourth one is completeness, and this is especially difficult or especially challenging for carbon accounting benchmarking, because we have, apart from all the other benchmarking challenges, we also definitely have incompleteness, and particularly in scope 3. So not all companies report on scope 3, not all companies report on scope 3 in the fullest extent, or they exclude stuff. And this gets very quickly obscured if we're just showing a scope 3 number. Like if you just get one number, it's so hard to judge how many of the companies behind that number have made certain assumptions on scope 3 categories and which one didn't. And so that is a big challenge in benchmarking data, is like what to do with those omitted scope 3 categories. So look at the image quickly from this paper. There's three specific categories. So there's like activity exclusion, so activities that are excluded that should have been included. There's boundary incompleteness, that like, things that weren't included in the original boundaries but they should have, and then general inconsistencies in the reporting that aren't applied properly. And it's omitted data, so of course it's hard to work with, but we think here that just resolution is a big solution already. Like if you just have enough resolution on the activity categories, for example, you can already start to see certain patterns, and you can at least address or correct or flag for these omitted emissions. So you can yeah, change your distribution or adapt your distributions for the incomplete data that you got. It's definitely not easy to do, and for example, reporting inconsistency is almost not doable without a proper auditing. But at least being aware and pointing them out and correcting for these gaps where we can is quite important. And then finally, and I guess it's like the main point, it should be actionable. Like we're not doing this for the beautiful color of our eyes. We want to have it actionable, right? And we want to make this benchmark work and do something and achieve something. And for that, it needs to tell us a signal or send us a signal on where to focus our attention. And also here, we think that just clarity in the activity categories is a big advantage, because then at least you can see I'm maybe behind on purchased goods and services, but I might be ahead in transportation, or I might be ahead in commuting, or maybe it's more my downstream, it's my product use or something that I am ahead or behind most of my peers. And this is even sector specific. You can see it in the image, like different sectors have completely different relationship to these different activity categories. But we think that more clarity on the granularity just is already like much more actionable and gives you much more insight on where to focus your attention and what to do with this benchmark data. And ideally, I think we can go even further, and we should have actionable items like companies that use this heating technique are there, and the companies that are not using this technique are there. Like even more specific yeah, details on how things are built up would be more actionable, but that's we're not there yet. So yeah, so summarizing, like relevance, normalization, distribution and completeness and actionable. So we just want um, things to be relevant and clear and applicable to your organization, maybe scaled where needed. We want a distribution so we can show the full aspect of it, and we want to correct where possible for Scope 3 emissions, and we want you to show you enough like deep level of detail so you can actually translate that into action. And that's where it all comes down for us. We're focusing on like just a lot of detail to show and a lot of consistent methodologies applied in carbon footprint and data to make a good benchmark. And I've set it all up for you, Kenneth, to show you now how we at least are trying to achieve that.
Yes, thanks a lot, Felix. I'll start sharing my screen again. That's easier so that I can walk through the slides myself. So you should again see my screen. If not, Felix, let me know. So basically, I will build upon what Felix said. So we'll present how we applied this benchmark in practice, from what data, what mathematical formulas we applied. And then towards the end, I'll come back to the 5 criteria that Felix presented, because I think we have a good basic benchmarking tool, but we're also not scoring like the top score on each of those 5 dimensions, right? And we're the final stage is not yet there for us. So to jump directly to basically how the benchmarking tool works in Carbon+Alt+Delete, right? And so as said, this is still not yet live in the app. That will still come in about a month. But basically, in Carbon+Alt+Delete, there is a benchmarking model that gives you the results that you see here on the slide. So you have for Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 1 and 2 together, Scope 3 total emissions, FTE and turnover. You have those bars indicating where a company is versus its peers. And what you see here, it's for all companies, so across sectors and across geographies. So on purpose, we've made it very broad. As said, it's of course more relevant if you compare it with the same geography and the same industry. But in this example, it's across. You see this small triangle, which is basically the company itself, and then you see the different percentiles of its peers. We'll get a bit more into detail on exactly how those percentiles work, because it's basically a one-dimensional representation of the typical probability density curves that we all know for our basic mathematics courses. But this is the end result. This is where we're working towards. So across different parts of the carbon footprint, the probability versus its peers, and then you basically can mark, okay, where is my company, which percentile is it? The input data that we need for this is on the one hand the carbon emissions, which of course we have on our platform as we're a carbon accounting platform, combined with what we call business metadata. So which industry, turnover, FTE, geographical location, etc. So what's behind this? How do we get there, right? So of course, we start from the data that we have on our platform. So today we have between 1,000 and 2,000 unique carbon footprints on the platform of different companies. Allow me to not disclose the exact number because it's maybe a bit too sensitive data, but also because it's just changing rapidly, right? So this is more than doubling year over year. It's the decent set of data. It's not a lot, like it's not about 10,000, 100,000 of data points. But the beauty of the data set that we have is that it's very detailed and very consistent. And I think, as Felix explained, these are 2 success criteria or conditions that we need to have or to build a successful benchmarking. So of all those 1 to 2,000 companies, we have the full carbon footprint structured in the same way, following the exact same structure according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and all the underlying details. So it's very consistent and very detailed data. And that allows us to build a benchmarking tool that can be more insightful and granular versus others where it's often not always clear what's behind in terms of carbon footprinting, or where it's hard to compare companies. So just to give a bit of more context on what's behind it in terms of type of companies. So the majority of the companies we have on the platform, or the data we have, are, let's say, mid-sized or mid-sized plus companies. If you would follow the European definition of an SME, you are an SME up until 250 FTE. So about half of the companies are below that, with the biggest chunk in, let's say, the M of the SME, so medium sized between 50 and 250 FTE. Half of the companies is larger than 250 FTE, equally split 250 to 1,000 and more than 1,000 FTE. By turnover, similar picture, right? Depending a bit exactly again on where you put the cutoff. So if you again take the SME European definition and you take the 50 million turnover as a cutoff, also the cutoff that once was used to define CSRD and which company to report. Who still remembers those good days? You see that half of the companies have a turnover of more than 50 million turnover. The majority of that between 50 and 500 million. Half of the companies are below the 50 million turnover. With a similar split, like 10 to 50 is more medium sized, 2 to 10 million small, and then below 2 million, you could label them as very small or micro companies. So and decent distribution, but majority mid-sized or right above SMEs. We also, to slice and dice data a bit in terms of sectors and geographies. So in sector, we ask the very detailed NACE code of companies, so that we can go very granular in grouping companies sector by sector. Here on this picture, you see them grouped at a higher level. So around 42% of the companies are industrial companies, with all the underlying specific industrial sectors: steel, manufacturing, cement, building, construction, etc. Around 39-40% are service companies. Distribution companies are retailers, companies in the logistics sector, and agricultural. It's a small minority of 3% of the companies. In terms of region, so I think most of you know that we're a Belgium-based company. So historically, the majority of our client base is in Belgium and the neighboring countries, Benelux, England, Germany. But basically, there are companies across Europe in our data set. And a final piece, and I think that's a very important piece, and that's maybe the piece where really the consistency of the data is really important. We have very good visibility on how complete the carbon footprint is, or on how many activities in the greenhouse gas protocol companies report. So you see, and that's actually the good news, that about half of them does really a full carbon footprint, covering scope 1, scope 2, and the majority of the scope 3 activities. Of course, not all, because typically not all of them are relevant. And then of the remaining half, it's, let's say, equally split. So 1/4 only does scope 1 and 2, and about 1/4 does scope 1 and 2 plus partial scope 3, which is then typically the business travel, employee commuting. So let's say, quote unquote, the easy scope 3. So that means that if we start benchmarking companies, if we look at the full carbon footprint, or if we look at scope 3, we only include the companies where we are confident those have included their full scope 3. So now we're comparing really apples to apples. If we look at scope 1 and 2 benchmarking, there we basically can include all companies, also the ones that have not done a full scope 3 benchmark. So then how does it work in terms of methodology, right? So this is the data that we started from. And then basically what we do are two big steps. The first one is normalization, and then the second is distribution. So the normalization, the two main drivers to normalize companies and to basically scale them to correct for their difference in size are FTE and turnover. The reality is that none of those are perfect normalization drivers. And we work with those. We have plans to further refine it, because as said, they're not perfect. So what you see here is a graph where basically every dot is a company. On the y-axis, you have the emissions. of that company in a certain year. On the x-axis, you see their FTE size. So there is a correlation, of course, between FTE and emissions. More people, more emissions. The best fit was not a linear fit, but a logarithmic fit, what you see here, with an R squared of around 0.09, which basically means that the variation or the difference between companies in terms of carbon footprint, around 9% of that variation can be explained by FTE. So in other words, FTE only explains 9% of why companies have different emissions. This figure, it's a disclaimer, is across industries. Of course, if you're gonna compare this industry per industry or sector per sector, typically that correlation goes up. And of course, so we have also done that exercise and then the number goes up, but order of magnitude, you don't get above 25, 30% of variation explained by FTE. We did a similar exercise for turnover. Similar story here, the linear correlation was the best fit. And actually the variance, so the R square, it's better, right? So you see here that 20% of the variation in emissions between companies can be explained by a difference in turnover. So turnover is, according to our analysis, currently the best scaling matrix to normalize companies. Two final words on this. If the correlation would be 1, then benchmarking becomes very easy because basically it's just one number and you don't have a distribution around it, right? So there needs to be certain uncertainties distribution between in emissions between companies that cannot be explained by an easy normalizing factor, because otherwise benchmarking would have become very easy. Second, we have been playing around with embedding our understanding of carbon accounting in this normalization. So for instance, I think we can all agree that scope 1 emissions of a service company, a law firm, an accountancy firm, it's probably more driven by the size in terms of FTE of that company than by their turnover, given that their emissions are heating of buildings, people driving around with company cars, typically things that are linked to FTE. If you go to industrial companies, I think we can all understand that stationary combustions or mobile combustion, so typically scope 1 emissions, are more driven by turnover, given that stationary combustion is linked to industrial processes and fossil fuels being burned for industrial processes, and that mobile combustion is mainly about own trucks running around with products that they make. So we will allow to both benchmark on or normalize on FTE and turnover, but on this analysis, we suggest you to use turnover as it explains more of the variation between companies. And then the second step is, once you have basically divided the emissions of company by their turnover, is that we start building the probabilistic distribution. And I think in the figures of Felix, he showed the typical, it were not exactly bell curves, but those typical two-dimensional curves with a probability and a distribution. We have, just in terms to make it more concise, decided to represent them in this one-dimensional chart. So let me explain a bit more in detail what it means. Once you understand it, it's very easy to understand, but we learned when discussing the team that you can also very quickly get confused. So what you see here is just for scope 1 emissions. You see the probability distribution just as a one-dimensional bar, where every of the 4 color parts that you see represents a part of the percentiles. So basically, let's assume we have 100 companies. Of those 100 companies, we calculate the scope 1 emissions. Maybe we normalize it by dividing for all those companies the emissions by their turnover. So we have 100 numbers, and we basically sort them from low to high. A company that's really completely at the left of this figure is basically the company with the lowest scope 1 emissions, absolute or normalized. Company number 100, so at the total right of this figure, is the company with the highest emission in that sample size. The median company, so the company is basically right in the middle, where half of the companies have lower emissions and half of the companies has higher emissions. It's here on the border between those two different types of green. So that's basically percentile 50. So you see that percentile 50, so the company with 50% lower, 50% higher, is only at, what would it be, around 15% of the emissions of the max company, right? So it's a pretty skewed distribution where the higher percentiles take more of the range of the distribution of the emissions. And that's basically the point that Felix also already made. Typically, those benchmarkings of emissions have what they call a fat tail, where the majority of the companies is grouped at the lower emissions. So you see percentile 1 to 25 taking only a small place, 25 to 50 around, I don't know, 0.10 of the range, but then the half of the companies with the highest emissions take the rest of the range. So that's basically what I just explained. So if you look at the 25% of the companies with the lowest emissions, they are here in this lightest green. And this allows you then also to plot specific companies. So once you have this benchmarking and once you have then for one specific company calculated emissions, you can start mapping that company on the carbon on the benchmark. So this triangle represents a specific company. So this company is in percentile 50 to 75. It's probably more around 65, 70. But you see that also this company only has around 40% of the highest emissions of the emissions of the highest emitting company, right? So this is this basically two-dimensional chart put together on a one-dimensional chart. And the main benefit of that is that you can give a very concise visual representation where you can see for the different drivers of your carbon footprint, where is my company doing, right? So you see for this example that this company overall has pretty high emissions, but on scope 3, it's in percentile 75 to percentile 100, so in the dark green. The same for scope 2, but for scope 1, it's only in percentile 50 to 75. So if you start thinking about how can we reduce my carbon emissions, purely on this benchmarking, you would first start looking at scope 2 emissions rather than scope 1 emissions, right? So that's the link towards the action planning. Maybe before doing the mapping with our scoring, final word on let's say certain biases or disclaimers. As with every benchmarking, the benchmark is only as good as the data that you have. As we only have data of companies that already actively manage and track their carbon footprint, we probably built our benchmark on a subset of data of companies that are doing better than all companies in the world, right? Assuming that companies that already track their emissions are ahead of companies that don't track it yet. Second, in the current state, we had to fill certain data gaps on what we call the business metadata using public searches ourselves, right? Google searches, ChatGPT searches, because we did not have of all the companies reliable FTE and turnover data. We'll refine the data as we go. User of the platform validate the data on FTE and turnover of the company, so that will refine as we go. But that's still currently the case. And a final piece, also important to know or to be very transparent, is we have cut off certain outliers. So where the data really seems odd, companies with very low FTEs, very high turnovers, or where the normalized distribution is really off, there we have basically cut off those data points. And overall, it's between 10 to 15% of the data points that we cut off because they seem to be at the very extreme up to a point where we're not sure if it were user mistakes or if it's really a reliable trend that we need to include in the benchmarking. So there we have been on the safe space and basically have been cut them off. To wrap up this part before we move to the Q&A, so these are again the 5 criteria that Felix has walked you through. How do we assess ourselves? So this is a self-assessment. So I'm not sure if we're too strict or not. I think in terms of relevance and normalization, I would say we're okay, but we're far from there, right? And this really has to do with the amount of data that we have. So I think we have around those 1,000 to 2,000 companies. It's a decent number of data points. But of course, it would be way better if we have 10 times, 50 times as much data. That would allow us to slice more detailed per region, have more granular normalization, etc. So I think there we have a good solid basis, but we can further improve as we have more data. On distribution and completeness, there I would give ourselves a pretty good score. And that's really because for all those companies, it's very consistent and very detailed, the data that we have. So that allows us to really, for instance, correct for gaps in carbon footprints and really make sure that we're not comparing companies with a partial carbon footprint with a full carbon footprint. And that also then allows us to build this very reliable distribution, probabilistic distribution. On actionable insights, I would give us a, what is here, 25% if you look at the dark green part. So I think there we are able to give first insights, like the example that I give you. Look, for this company, it's rather about their scope 2 than their scope 1, or the other way. I forgot the exact example. But for us, it is really the starting point, right? If we would have more data, we can start building reliable benchmarks on the level of individual activities, so that you can even go one level deeper and say, oh, in my scope 1, it's rather my mobile combustion than my stationary combustion, where I'm doing worse than my peers. And then the next step is that as we also have mitigation planning, target setting in the tool, that we start including that in the benchmarking and are able to say, look, in your peers, we see that X% of them already has set a science-based target. And the ones that are doing well typically have specific actions on electrification of their vehicles, or on scope 3, on recycling of their specific products, etc., etc. So of course, it all depends on the amount of data and the granularity of data that you have. But that's for us really the dot at the horizon where we're working towards. So with that, Felix, I think you have been keeping an eye on the Q&A. Are there already specific questions that we should address?
Yeah, there's multiple questions coming in. It's very interesting. I tried to filter for the ones that have the most general application. I think very quickly, don't spend ages on it. Just some more details are requested on like underlying data. So they're asking like report date, what years are included? Is it 23, 24? Is it both? Is it all? And some idea on like this scope 1 and 2. There was just question on how easy it was to define if it was complete or not.
Yeah. Can I take the first one? Now you can take the second one, right, Felix? Because we have been working on that together. The first question, okay, what is included in this benchmarking? So currently in the version 1, we only split companies or cluster them based on their industry, not yet on their geography, not yet on the time horizon. And that's kind of the trade-off that we have made between clustering it very relevantly, because we all know that the emissions of a company in Germany are not necessarily the same of a similar company in Spain. And we also all know that companies 2 years later might be lower than now. So more granular clustering, the better. But at the same time, you need to have a decent sample size to make a statistically sound statement, right? And so with those 1,000-2,000 companies that we have, if we do the analysis, if we really start splitting them country by country, year by year, we don't have enough data yet to give you meaningful insights. And then we did the analysis, and basically the difference between sectors are more important, have a higher correlation than the difference between countries and between time. So that's where we are now. So basically, to answer the question, the data that you've seen is we only take the latest reporting year of a company, but that means in practice that sometimes we are benchmarking carbon footprint of 2024 with 23 and 2022. So that's the majority of the 3 years that we have.
Yeah, I would maybe expand on that a little bit, that like we are doing regional and time clustering in some sense, just by the way that our company is. Like we're a very Eurocentric company, and we only have been existing for a couple of years. So that is a clustering in itself, right? Like my example for was 20 years time difference in China. Like these things are like we don't have 1990s China data basically on the platform. So that is kind of it's clustering in itself. And indeed, I'll take the second question. So I'll combine it actually with a question from Climact, which was about like, do you know the carbon footprints? How do you know that the carbon footprints are complete? Do you trust your consultants to do a good job? Was the question here. And I think here, if we go back to the part in my slides where we have the three types of incompleteness, there's only a few types of incompleteness that you can spot directly, like just on the carbon footprint data itself. So that's the ones that we focus on. So there's like substantial misrepresentation correction that is like impossible to see without a proper auditing. We will also not be able to see that by just looking at the data, but we can see quite clear trends in just the activity categories that are reported. Just like goods and services is just expected to have a certain size of your total footprint, regardless of sector. Like, and if we fall below that mark, we flag that as to be looked at as like probably incomplete. So that's one of the things. In certain sectors, you just expect, like in a transport sector, you just expect or a heavy goods sector, you expect transport to be there and to be substantial. If we don't see that, then we can flag it as incomplete. So those are things that just show up and that we can use. We try to be like both have quite clear cuts and don't cut out incomplete data too quickly, but we also avoid including data that's just like immediately obviously incomplete or wrong. So that is that part, and let me go back to you, Kenneth. So how many? We have 5 minutes. Okay, that is not too bad. There was an additional question now. Sorry, I'm thinking what we have. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if we can say a general thing about scope 1, 2 sector. Okay, sorry, I think I've already discussed that part as well. Um, so,
Unless you have other questions, I saw some question about public availability and data, right? So
yes,
I can answer
yes,
that unless you
yeah,
have
go
other
for that one.
questions.
No, I have one
So
to wrap up then. Yeah.
so the benchmarking tool, as we have shown it, with the options to filter by sector, compare in detail, is part of our platform. So we will not make that available as a standalone, publicly available, free to use tool. I saw someone mentioning the idea of having benchmark reports. In full transparency, we have not been thinking about that, but I like that a lot. So you might have triggered that as an idea, and you might see something passing by over the coming months there. In terms of data and how we use the data, right? So I very much understand the question. So what we do is the user inputs data on the carbon footprint and on the company, this bit meta data, FTE, turnover, location, etc. Then we basically take an anonymized copy of that with just per activity, the emissions, and then the FTE in the turnover, the country, the sector. And that goes into our benchmarking module on our server. And what you see in the front end are basically the figures that I've shown you, where you see the probability curves, right? So that's how we use the data. That's also how we explain it in our terms and conditions. So it's anonymized, non-reverse engineerable way of using the data for this benchmark product. And then I understand the question around that, of course, because it's important to be correct and transparent on that. But we have never received pushback. We have received questions on that, but never received pushback on this use of the benchmarking data.
Yeah, I have a small thing that wanted to highlight from the chat, and then I have a final question for you, Kenneth. So I just wanted to point out that there was also a question about like other benchmarking metrics, not FTE, not turnover, but like a more sector specific is like goods produced or hours of service delivered, all that kind of stuff. And we had this internal discussion as well. These are the best benchmarks, but they're just not generalizable. Like they are so different in subsectors that we cannot generalize them at this stage, and we don't have the data available. Maybe we'll be looking into them later, but that's not something we have right now. And a final question I want to go throw at you, Kenneth, was someone asking, hey, what are the things that we at Carbon Lead users can do to help improve your internal data set for the benchmark?
Great question. Have we briefed that person? That's actually a final point we wanted to make. So of course, the better the data, the better the benchmark, right? So, and we need two types of data. We need emission data, and that's I think, the question of climate. So please do a full carbon footprint with reliable carbon data, but I hope I don't need to convince you of that. Second, the biggest piece of data that we were actually missing is this business metadata. So if you report on Carbon+Delete, in this benchmark functionality, please also fill in the sector, FTE, turnover of this company so that we can properly take it into account into the benchmark. And if everyone does it, the benchmark become better for everyone. Right? I think in the interest of time, let's stop here. I don't know, Felix, if there are still questions that are unanswered. As always, we will get back to the person who asked that question over email. Before I let you go, I want to make one word of publicity. So we have some new webinars coming up. We'll share the invites also in the next in the debrief email. So the next big one is in February on the Scope 2 guidance. And we also have already in 2 weeks a new one. This is mainly relevant for people in Belgium. Is about Cube, a new initiative launched by the banks, basically, to make ESG reporting easier for companies in Belgium. So we'll have a webinar where we host Caromia, the technology partner behind this initiative, and we'll dive into exactly what it is. With that, I will stop here. Thanks a lot for joining us today. Thanks a lot for the questions. We'll share the debrief, the slides, and the recordings. And then I wish you a great rest of the day. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.